Why 99% of people remain trapped in their own destructive thoughts, and how to break free in 30 days. Most people believe they are thinking freely, making choices, and shaping their own lives. Yet beneath the surface, 99% of them are living inside a prison built not of walls but of thoughts. These are not random thoughts but repetitive loops, cycles of self-doubt, fear, and negativity that repeat so often they feel like truth. You wake up in the morning and the same script runs. I'm not enough, I'll probably fail. Nothing ever changes. By night, the voice grows louder, rehearsing every mistake as if replaying evidence in a courtroom. Without realizing it, you become both the prisoner and the guard, locked inside an invisible cage of destructive thoughts. The brain itself builds this prison. Neuroscience shows that your mind evolved to focus on threats more than opportunities. This negativity bias once helped our ancestors survive, but in modern life it keeps us trapped in anxiety and self-sabotage. Cortisol floods the body as if every challenge were life or death, while dopamine, the fuel of progress, gets hijacked by fear. Each destructive thought strengthens the circuit until the brain mistakes repetition for reality. You start believing the lie, not because it's true, but because your nervous system has rehearsed it too many times. Philosophy saw this danger long before neuroscience. Marcus Aurelius warned that the soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts. Montaigne confessed that people suffer more in imagination than in reality. Descartes built his method on doubting what seemed certain, because he knew the mind often deceives itself. Their message is clear. The greatest tyrant is not the world outside, but the unchecked voice within. But here is the revelation. The prison is not locked. The same brain that builds destructive loops has the power to rewire itself. Neuroplasticity proves that with deliberate practice, thoughts can be reshaped, circuits can be rewired, and destructive loops can be replaced with patterns of clarity, focus, and resilience. In just 30 days of consistent practice, you can begin to dismantle the prison that 99% of people never escape. This video is your blueprint for that escape.
You will see why the mind traps itself, how biology reinforces the cycle, and most importantly, how philosophy and science together offer a way out. This is not about shallow motivation. It is about understanding the mechanics of thought, exposing the lies that keep you bound, and reclaiming authorship of your inner world. The walls of this prison are invisible, but once you see them, you can begin to break them. The invisible cage of thought loops.
Destructive thoughts do not arrive as isolated events. They repeat, recycle, and feed on themselves until they become a self-sustaining system. This is the invisible cage of thought loops. You think you are reflecting, but in truth you are rehearsing the same accusations, the same fears, the same imagined failures. These loops are not just mental noise. They become grooves in the brain, circuits that strengthen with each repetition until they feel automatic, natural, and impossible to escape. Psychology calls this rumination, the tendency to replay negative experiences in search of meaning, but finding only exhaustion. The critic convinces you that if you keep thinking about the problem, you will find a solution. Instead, the mind circles the same track endlessly, deepening the wound. Andrew Huberman explains that focus is the architect of neuroplasticity. What you repeatedly attend to, your brain builds stronger. Every destructive loop is literally wiring the prison bars tighter. The tragedy is that many mistake these loops for identity. This is just who I am, they say, not realizing it is simply a habit of thought reinforced over time. Marcus Aurelius warned that the quality of your thoughts determines the quality of your soul. When thought loops go unchallenged, they do not only steal your mood for the day, they sculpt the person you become. Yet there is something even more deceptive. Loops feel safe. They are predictable, familiar, and strangely comforting in their misery. The brain prefers the certainty of repetition over the discomfort of change. So you remain in the cage, not because you love it, but because it feels less frightening than the unknown. To recognize the loop is the first act of rebellion. The moment you notice, this is not truth, This is repetition. You create a crack in the cage. That awareness, however small, begins the process of escape. The invisible becomes visible, and what once felt like destiny is exposed as nothing more than habit. The biology of mental chains. The prison of destructive thoughts is not only psychological, it is biological. Your brain and body are wired to react in ways that make these loops stronger, as though your nervous system itself were conspiring to keep you trapped. When stress or fear appears, cortisol floods your bloodstream, heightening vigilance and locking your focus on threats. This survival response was useful when danger meant predators or famine, but in modern life it misfires, treating rejection, failure, or uncertainty as life or death emergencies. The result is an exaggerated sense of danger that keeps destructive thoughts alive. Dopamine, the neurotransmitter of motivation and pursuit, becomes hijacked in this process. Instead of fueling progress toward meaningful goals, it begins reinforcing the loop of worry and self-criticism. Every time you rehearse a fear, imagining failure, anticipating rejection, dopamine fuels the cycle, as if preparing you to act on the imagined threat. But the action never comes, only more rumination. This creates a paradox. Your brain rewards the very habit that keeps you stuck. Serotonin also plays a crucial role. Known as the stabilizer of mood, it balances your sense of well-being and confidence. When destructive thought loops dominate, serotonin levels fluctuate, creating feelings of instability and helplessness. The critic sounds more convincing when your chemistry is imbalanced because your emotional foundation is already weakened. Neuroscientists like Andrew Huberman explain that these chemical systems are plastic. They can be retrained. Just as repetition strengthens destructive circuits, deliberate practice can redirect dopamine and serotonin toward constructive habits. Small wins, intentional focus, and regulated breathing can recalibrate the brain, shifting it out of survival mode and back into growth. Philosophy anticipated this long before brain scans existed. Seneca wrote that we suffer more in imagination than in reality, pointing to the mind's tendency to exaggerate threats. Descartes insisted that true clarity comes only after stripping away illusion, including the illusion created by our own biology. To recognize that mental chains are chemical as well as psychological is to realize they are not absolute. They can be weakened, reshaped, and broken. Why comfort is more dangerous than pain. When most people think about what traps them in destructive thoughts, they imagine pain, the sting of failure, the weight of rejection, the fear of loss. Yet the truth is far more unsettling. It is not pain that keeps 99% of people stuck. It is comfort. The brain is designed to prefer what is familiar, even if the familiar is toxic. A predictable misery feels safer to the nervous system than an uncertain freedom. And so, many choose to stay in the loop, not because it feels good, but because it feels known. Neuroscience shows that the brain conserves energy by clinging to established pathways. The same destructive thoughts, rehearsed for years, require little effort to maintain. Change, on the other hand, demands new wiring, new circuits, new effort, and the brain resists because it perceives this as risk. Pain forces adaptation, but comfort seduces you into stagnation. This is why so many people remain trapped. They confuse the absence of immediate suffering with stability, unaware that this comfort is slowly corroding their potential. Psychology calls this cognitive inertia, the tendency of the mind to resist altering its course, even when the current direction is harmful. You may catch yourself saying, "At least I know what to expect," as if predictability were proof of safety. But predictability is not freedom. It is captivity disguised as peace. The Stoics warned of this trap. Marcus Aurelius wrote that we cling to what is habitual, even if it diminishes us, and that true strength is found in choosing growth over ease. Andrew Huberman reminds us that discomfort is the gateway to neuroplasticity. The brain only begins to change when pushed into unfamiliar territory. Comfort does not challenge, therefore it does not transform. Joe Dispenza echoes this, showing how repeating the same emotional states day after day wires the body to live in the past, making change impossible without a deliberate break from routine. The danger of comfort is that it whispers, "Stay here, you're safe," while silently draining your capacity to evolve. To recognize comfort as the greater threat is to wake up to a deeper truth. The life you want will not be found in what is familiar. It will only emerge when you step willingly into the discomfort of change, where new thoughts can finally be born. The echo effect. How old voices still control you. Many of the destructive thoughts that dominate your present are not born in this moment at all. They are echoes, voices from the past, still reverberating in your mind, as if the people who spoke them never left. A parent's sharp criticism, a teacher's humiliating remark, a peer's cruel laughter. These moments imprint themselves on the nervous system, leaving behind a pattern of self-judgment that persists long after the original voice has fallen silent. What you think of as your own inner critic is often nothing more than a chorus of borrowed voices replaying themselves in your head. Psychology identifies this as internalization. The brain, especially in childhood, absorbs external judgments and stores them as internal standards. Over time, these standards become automatic, triggering without conscious awareness. You may find yourself thinking, "I'll never be enough," without realizing that this phrase once belonged to someone else. The echo effect makes these voices feel like identity, when in reality they are memories, ghosts disguised as truth. Neuroscience sheds light on why these echoes endure. The amygdala and hippocampus, the centers of emotional memory, prioritize painful experiences to protect you from repeating them. The brain interprets humiliation or rejection as danger, so it keeps the memory vivid, replaying it as a warning. But in doing so, it imprisons you in the past, convincing you that you are still that vulnerable child in need of protection. Philosophy offers liberation from these ghosts. Descartes taught that certainty can only come when every assumption has been doubted and tested. Marcus Aurelius insisted that opinions, whether from others or ourselves, do not define reality unless we give them power. Montaigne admitted that much of what torments us is not the event itself, but the echo of it, kept alive by our own attention. The moment you see your destructive thoughts as echoes, you weaken their hold. An echo has no substance. It is sound without source, vibration without body. It can only persist if you keep listening. To recognize the critic as an old voice, not your true self, is to take back authorship of your mind. And in that recognition, the past begins to release its grip on the present. The hidden reward of negative thinking. Destructive thoughts appear to be pure torment, but the reason they persist is that, at some level, the brain finds them rewarding. This is the paradox few recognize. Negative thinking gives a false sense of control. When you predict failure, your brain feels prepared for it. When you imagine rejection, you think you are protecting yourself from surprise. By rehearsing the worst outcomes, the mind tricks itself into believing it is safer. But this safety is an illusion. It is a cage built from fear. Neuroscience explains this as a form of maladaptive conditioning. Each time you expect the worst, and it doesn't happen, dopamine still fires because the brain feels it predicted correctly. Over time, the brain learns to seek comfort in pessimism, rewarding itself for being cautious. This is why many people cling to destructive thoughts even when they hate them. Those thoughts have become familiar patterns of false protection. Psychology reinforces this with the concept of secondary gain. Negative thinking provides hidden benefits, excuses to avoid risk, shields against disappointment, rationalizations for inaction. If I expect nothing, I can't be let down. But this bargain comes at the cost of growth. The critic keeps you small, convincing you that limitation is safety, when in truth, it is paralysis. Philosophy exposes the lie. Seneca argued that those who fear suffering suffer before it even arrives, paying the price of pain twice, once in imagination, once in reality. Marcus Aurelius insisted that expecting the worst does not prepare you, it chains you. Descartes would remind us that false certainty is more dangerous than doubt because it leaves no room for truth to enter. The hidden reward of negative thinking is that it makes you feel prepared, but in exchange, it robs you of possibility. Recognizing this trade is essential because once you see that the reward is a trap, the desire to indulge in it weakens. The critic offers you counterfeit safety. The real safety comes from building resilience, clarity, and action, not from rehearsing disaster, but from creating new outcomes. The 30-day reset blueprint. The most liberating discovery of modern neuroscience is that destructive thoughts are not permanent. They are circuits, neural pathways that have been reinforced through repetition. And just as repetition built them, repetition can dismantle them. This is the promise of neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself based on what you consistently practice. In as little as 30 days, you can begin reshaping the architecture of your mind, weakening the loops that imprison you, and strengthening pathways that lead to clarity and resilience. Joe Dispenza explains that every thought sends a signal, and every repeated thought wires neurons together more tightly. The brain does not distinguish between imagination and reality. It strengthens whatever it rehearses. This is why destructive loops feel so real. You've trained your brain to believe them. But when you deliberately focus on new narratives, truths grounded in resilience, possibility, and meaning, you begin to build competing circuits. With practice, these new pathways gain strength while the old ones fade. Andrew Huberman emphasizes that focus is the lever of neuroplasticity. What you repeatedly pay attention to is what your brain rewires around. This is why a structured 30-day reset works. By dedicating even a few minutes daily to reframing thoughts, practicing self-awareness, and engaging the body in regulation, through breath, posture, or movement, you create a biochemical environment for change. Dopamine begins to reward growth, serotonin stabilizes mood, and endorphins reinforce momentum. Philosophy provides the same blueprint in timeless language. Aristotle taught that character is formed by habits, not by single acts. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself daily of principles he wished to embody, carving resilience into his mind. Descartes broke down complex problems into daily steps, proving that transformation comes through consistent practice. The wisdom is universal. Identity is shaped by repetition. A 30-day reset is not about instant perfection. It is about proving to your brain that new patterns are possible. Every day you repeat resilience instead of ruin, you weaken the critic's voice and strengthen your own. In 1 month, the walls of the prison begin to crack. And once the cracks appear, the light of freedom can finally enter. The CBT counterpunch. The inner critic thrives on absolute statements. You always fail. You will never change. Everyone sees your weakness. These words strike with the weight of inevitability, leaving no room for defense. Cognitive behavioral therapy offers a counterpunch, not by denying the thought, but by dismantling it with evidence and reframing it into a form the brain can challenge. When you transform an accusation into a question, you rob it of its authority and open space for a different outcome. Psychology explains this through cognitive restructuring. A destructive thought, left untested, feels like fact. But when you ask, is it true that I always fail? What evidence proves this? What small step could disprove it today? The critic's certainty crumbles. The brain is forced to move from emotional reaction to rational analysis, activating the prefrontal cortex and reducing the grip of the amygdala. What once felt like an iron law is revealed as a distortion, overgeneralization, catastrophizing, black and white thinking. The counterpunch is not aggression, it is precision. Andrew Huberman highlights that attention directs neuroplasticity. By choosing to shift focus from accusation to inquiry, you weaken the old circuit and build a new one. Each time you catch the critic and replace "I can't" with "How could I begin?" you carve a fresh neural path. With repetition, this becomes the default, and the critic's voice grows faint. Philosophers practiced their own versions of this counterpunch. Descartes doubted every claim until it proved itself, refusing to bow to untested certainty. Marcus Aurelius challenged his own impressions, reminding himself that most judgments are not reality, but interpretations. Montaigne dissected his fears with curiosity, shrinking them down until they lost their power. Their wisdom aligns with CBT. Thoughts are not facts, and every claim must face trial. The CBT counterpunch does not silence the critic, but it turns its shouts into whispers. Each reframed question is a strike against mental tyranny, each demand for evidence a step toward freedom. Over time, you realize the critic was never truth. It was only noise waiting to be challenged. Philosophy against mental tyranny. Destructive thoughts dominate when we accept them as unquestionable truths. Philosophy arms us with methods to dismantle these illusions at their root. Descartes taught us that doubt is a tool, not a weakness. By systematically questioning every thought, is this true? Can I be certain? We reveal the shaky foundations on which toxic beliefs stand. Thoughts that feel inevitable collapse under scrutiny. Aristotle adds precision. Clarity and logic become weapons against emotional chaos. He reminds us that reasoning is not just an abstract skill, it shapes how we interpret reality. A thought claiming, "I am worthless," must meet the rigor of evidence. What are the observable facts? What alternatives exist? Philosophy demands that feelings be weighed against reason, that emotions are guides, not dictators. The Stoics, particularly Marcus Aurelius and Seneca, teach detachment from inner judgments. The mind confuses a passing thought with identity. "This thought does not define me," Marcus Aurelius writes. By seeing destructive ideas as external visitors rather than personal truths, you step outside the grip of tyranny. You observe, you respond, you choose. Emotional reactions soften because philosophy trains the mind to distinguish between perception and reality. Combining doubt, logic, and detachment creates a mental fortress. Your inner critic loses sovereignty over your identity. Philosophy does not erase thoughts. It reassigns them to their proper place as transient signals to examine, not permanent verdicts to obey. You reclaim authority over your mind by proving that not every voice deserves power. The body as a weapon against toxic thoughts. The mind and body are inseparable allies. Toxic thoughts often gain power because we inhabit a body that mirrors stress. Slouched posture, shallow breathing, and tension-filled muscles signal the brain that danger is near. Neuroscience shows that the amygdala responds to bodily cues as much as to thoughts. If your body screams threat, your mind obeys. Posture becomes a silent language of authority. Standing tall, opening the chest, and aligning the spine sends signals to your brain that you are in control. Breathing deeply engages the parasympathetic nervous system, reducing cortisol levels and lowering the intensity of destructive loops. Even simple physical movements, walking, stretching, or deliberate gestures, can interrupt entrenched thought patterns, breaking the cycle of rumination. Andrew Huberman's research emphasizes that the nervous system listens to the body before it listens to reason. You cannot outthink panic, anxiety, or shame without first resetting the physiological state. Controlled movement, breathwork, and tension release literally change the neurochemical landscape, tipping the scales toward calm, focus, and clarity. The body is not passive. It is your first line of defense against mental tyranny. When you move intentionally, breathe deliberately, and occupy space fully, destructive thoughts encounter resistance. Your mind learns to follow the cues of strength, not fear. The body becomes a weapon, a catalyst for neurochemical balance, and a visible declaration that you will not be ruled by every passing toxic thought. The emotional detox, replacing shame with awareness. Destructive thoughts often disguise themselves as truth, but beneath their surface, they are nearly always soaked in shame. Shame is the silent fuel that keeps toxic thinking alive. It whispers that you are fundamentally broken, unworthy, beyond repair. And because it speaks so intimately, it feels convincing. But here's the twist. Shame loses its power the moment it is named. Daniel Goleman's work on emotional intelligence reveals a core truth. What you can name, you can regulate. Awareness is the beginning of detox. When you catch yourself thinking, "I always ruin everything," the goal isn't to argue with the thought, but to observe it. With enough emotional clarity, that inner attack can be translated into its true voice. "I'm afraid of repeating a mistake." That shift, subtle but powerful, breaks the emotional spell. Shame thrives in silence and vagueness. It wraps around the mind when we lack language for what we feel. But when you build the emotional vocabulary to say, "I feel overwhelmed, I feel small, I feel dismissed," something profound happens. The brain begins processing emotion through the prefrontal cortex instead of the limbic system. In other words, you regain control. This emotional detox is not about replacing every negative thought with a forced positive one. It's about creating a reflective gap, a space between the reaction and your awareness. And within that gap, destructive thoughts lose their status as absolute truth. When you learn to name your emotional states without judgment, curiosity instead of condemnation, you disarm the critic. You don't fight shame with power. You dissolve it with presence. You detox the mind not by purging emotions, but by learning to sit with them long enough to understand their real message. Awareness becomes your inner light, and once you turn it on, shame has nowhere left to hide. Building the inner ally in 30 days. You were not born with a voice that tears you down. That voice was built, layer by layer, echo by echo, through repetition, pain, comparison, and fear. But here's what neuroscience and philosophy agree on. If a destructive inner voice can be constructed, a resilient one can be trained. And it doesn't take a lifetime. With intention, it can begin in 30 days. The transformation begins by replacing the passive acceptance of inner criticism with conscious construction of a new inner voice, a voice that is neither delusional nor soft, but fiercely honest, wise, and empowering. Joe Dispenza's work shows how, through repetition, the brain rewires itself. Neural pathways that once carried destructive messages weaken when they are not used. At the same time, new ones grow stronger with use, like muscles trained daily. For 30 days, this isn't about positive thinking. It's about building a new inner relationship based on evidence, not emotion. Start each day with a question. What would my best self say to me right now? And then answer it. Out loud, in writing, in thought, repeatedly. As often as the critic once spoke, the new voice must now speak. Frequency is power. Reinforce this voice with action. When the old critic says you're lazy, don't argue. Stretch, breathe, stand tall. Prove the critic wrong with motion, not negotiation. Anchor your new voice in behavior. Anchor it in choice. Anchor it in the small victories that build belief. And perhaps most importantly, stop waiting for the inner ally to feel natural. It won't, at first. But neuroscience proves that what feels unnatural today can become your default identity tomorrow. Consistency creates character. By the end of 30 days, the critic will still whisper. But now it will have competition, and that competition will be a voice you chose, you built, and you earned. Not an echo of your past, but the blueprint of who you are becoming, the rebellion that redefines you. There comes a moment in every transformation when the silence of old thoughts feels louder than the noise that once ruled you. When the toxic loops weaken, not because they disappear, but because you no longer give them authority. That's when you realize the real escape was never external. It was the moment you stopped believing the voice that kept you small. Freedom doesn't always feel like fireworks or revelation. Sometimes it feels like doing the right thing when no one is watching. Like choosing to speak gently to yourself after a setback. Like not reacting the way you used to. That's not just progress. That's rebellion. A rebellion against the inherited voice of shame. A rebellion against the invisible patterns that dictated your worth. A rebellion against being a prisoner in a cage that was never locked. The Stoics called this inner mastery. Descartes called it clear and distinct perception. Neuroplasticity calls it rewiring. But in human terms, it's this: You finally become the author of your own mind. Not a passive recipient of inherited scripts, but a conscious sculptor of your mental reality. When you break free, your thoughts don't need to be perfect. They need to be yours. You stop performing for approval and start acting with intention. You stop living on autopilot and start making choices that align with your future, not your past. This isn't a fairy tale ending. It's a beginning. Because the next time destructive thoughts show up, they'll be met with resistance. Not from fear, but from clarity. Not from avoidance, but from self-respect. And that clarity, that calm, deliberate rebellion, is how freedom sounds on the inside. Your mind is not your enemy. It is your battlefield. And from this point forward, you fight not to escape yourself, but to return home to who you were before the world told you who to be. You are not broken. You are being rebuilt.